speaking to negative China.
I saw Omar perspiring up here. Aside from that, I think it's better to take the coat off, even with my favorite shalom pin, shalom meaning peace, which is where I stand, and have stood for many years. But sometimes I feel like that old man in his city who went to the wall, the Western Wall, we call it the Kotel, some call it the Wailing Wall, and he was seen there every day by a reporter for Time magazine, and he was praying every day. And one day she went up to him and she said, "Old man, can you tell me, what is it you go there to pray for?" He said, "I go there every day and I'm praying for peace." And she said, "And what does it feel like to go there every day and pray for peace?" He says, "Well, sometimes I feel like I'm talking to a wall." So those of us who are working for peace in the Middle East, and I have for many years, that's sort of my retirement vocation, or one of them, sometimes get a little frustrated, but we keep on going. I'm not used to debating Palestinians. Usually I spend my time debating right-wing Jewish groups in a very conservative Canadian Jewish community. So I'm more practiced with that than I am in disagreeing with Omar. My weekly editorials for Montreal's Radio Shalom, articles in both the American and Canadian Jewish press, are often, for the most part, sharply critical of Israel's policies. Canadian Friends of Peace Now and its American counterpart are among the sponsors in Israel of Shalom Akshav, Peace Now, and of its Settlement Watch. And we advocate a two-state solution and ending the occupation. So we work for peace with an objective of ending the occupation and bringing to fruition two states in the Middle East, a democratic Israel, hopefully, living next to a peaceful Palestine. And that's our dream. And we don't separate our means and how we work for it, our objectives, from the end result. We think they work together, and they have to work together. Well, tonight I'm going to argue a few simple points. First, I maintain that any successful and fair advocacy must be in accord with universally accepted and applied standards of human rights. That is to say that the application of such standards only to Israel and not to the Palestinians, to the other nations of the Middle East, or to other nations around the world not only lacks credibility, but it gives rise to the charge of anti-Semitism. It is certainly not to say that all criticism of Israel is by definition anti-Semitic, but any action or criticism which singles out Israel in isolation from other and often more egregious human rights violators will and should be perceived as anti-Semitic. Second, I will argue that many of the boycotters are not peace advocates, but rather that their hope is to turn Israel into the principal international pariah, hoping that the Zionist state will crumble and be succeeded by a single state. Third, if the goal is peace, then we should all hope and work for the revival of a strong Israeli peace movement to make common cause with Palestinian advocates of two states. However, the boycott policy is almost sure to force Israelis to the right because it feeds their widely shared perception that the entire world is against the Jews, a phenomena that we term, and many in Israel term, the Holocaust mentality. It may be irrational that it's still there today, that they still see themselves besieged, but as one great peace advocate in Israel says, to ignore the irrational is irrational. So that's a very formidable force within Israel. My fourth point is that the U.S. is still the most essential player in the Middle East. And now, at the end of 8 disastrous years of Bush and Cheney, there is a new president who has re-engaged our country, the United States, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's essential to recognize that in this country, the so-called Israel lobby is a major player in the making of American foreign policy. But it must and it can be neutralized. Boycotts will, however, feed the power of the Israel lobby, and those of us who hope that President Obama and Senator Mitchell can move the peace process to fruition must then work against boycotts. I want to flesh out these points now. In order for you to understand my basic approach to history and current affairs, I want to quote a great American journalist. His name was I.F. Stone. He was a wonderful critic of the Vietnam War, and he declared, "History is not melodrama, it is most often tragedy." That is, it's not one-sided. It's not what we call a Manichaean world. Good guys and bad guys, cowboys and black hats and white hats, so we can tell who the good guys and the bad guys are. Life and the world are much more complicated. And Israel is much more complicated. It's a country I've visited several times. It's a country that is both marvelous and infuriating, on the cusp of science, technology, and the arts, but politically enslaved to fundamentalist rabbis and benighted settlers on the West Bank. I've seen the wall they have erected, not only for security, and part of the reason is security, but in some places clearly to grab land. I am all too keenly aware of an occupation that oppresses the Palestinians and undermines, what's important to me, the fabric of Israeli democracy. I have read the reports of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International on Israel, the Palestinians, and their Arab neighbors, and am appalled by the violations of human rights on all sides. So my first point is that the universal standard of human rights must be applied across the board. Those who single out Israel and are silent on Palestinian violations of human rights are clearly not credible. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch both point out that both Hamas and Fatah, the ruling group on the West Bank, have been killing, maiming, and torturing their perceived opponents. Both have closed down opposition media and detained their enemies in violation of any due process. Beyond Israel and Palestine, we listen to the human rights organizations, all of us do. We respect them because they fearlessly point out the atrocities in Sudan, Darfur, the jailings in Iran, the oppressions of women and gay citizens in much of the Middle East, etc. Nor are these organizations silent on the war crimes of Israel or the Palestinians. Qasem rockets fired from Gaza on innocent Israeli citizens without guidance systems, one of which killed 2 Palestinian kids, are clearly criminal acts. They're outside of the pale. And they're aiming at civilian population centers. That makes them murder weapons. Hopefully the great epidemic of suicide bombers aimed at civilians gathered in pizza parlors